My name is Daniel Harris, and I'm 67 years old. I've lived long enough to see fortunes made and lost, buildings rise and fall, families built and broken. But nothing in all my years prepared me for the day I discovered that my own children were plotting to take everything I built and leave me with nothing but shame. If you're listening to my story right now, I'll ask you something simple. Please subscribe. Not because I need followers or fame. I've already had more wealth and power than most men ever dream of, but because what I'm about to tell you is a warning. A lesson about family, greed, and the price of betrayal. I was born in a small town in Ohio, son of a steel worker and a schoolteacher. I learned early that nothing comes easy, and the only way to rise above was to outwork and outlast every man beside you. In my 20s, I started Harris & Sons Construction with a second-hand pickup truck and 2 employees who believed in me. By my 40s, we weren't just pouring foundations. We were building the skyline of half the Midwest. By my 50s, we were signing multi-million-dollar government contracts. The kind of deals that make people treat you differently when you walk into a room. But what I was most proud of wasn't the money or the skyscrapers. It was the name, Harris & Sons. The idea that this company wasn't just mine, but something I'd hand down to my children. I believed it would bind us together, a legacy none of us could ever betray. My eldest, Michael, was the one I always thought would carry the torch. He's 38 now, smart, ambitious, the kind of man who can command a room with just his voice. When he was a boy, he used to sit in my office chair, pretending to sign contracts, telling me one day he'd make me proud. My daughter Sarah, 34, has always been sharp with numbers. She studied finance, graduated top of her class, and I thought she'd be the steady hand in the family, the one who'd keep everyone honest. And then there's David, the youngest at 29, my dreamer. Creative, restless, never quite certain where he belonged, but always with a spark of brilliance when you least expected it. I thought I had given them everything: education, security, a life free of the struggles I had faced. Maybe that was my first mistake, because sometimes when you give people everything, they start to believe they deserve more than you, more than anyone. For years, I carried the weight of this empire on my back. Even as age slowed me down, I refused to step aside. I told myself it was because the business still needed me. But deep down, I was afraid. Afraid that if I let go, if I handed over the keys too soon, they wouldn't respect what it had cost to build. Afraid they'd take shortcuts, cut corners, forget the values that had gotten us here. Still, I loved them. And love makes fools of us all. I convinced myself that one day, they'd understand the burden I carried and thank me for protecting it until they were ready. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that they weren't waiting for me to pass the torch. They were planning to snatch it from my hands. The first cracks showed themselves in whispers. I'd walk into a room and conversations would stop. Papers would disappear from my desk. Michael began suggesting that the company needed fresh leadership, using words like modernization and new vision. Sarah stopped coming to me for advice, handling accounts on her own, keeping things from me under the guise of efficiency. David grew distant, torn between loyalty to his siblings and love for me. At first, I brushed it off. Families argue, siblings align, business creates tension. That's normal. But then I started to notice patterns. Board members who had always respected me now deferred to Michael. Contractors I'd worked with for decades were suddenly dealing with Sarah directly. And David, my youngest, avoided my gaze, as if ashamed of something he couldn't yet say. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. Distant thunder at first, then darkening skies, then the winds that stripped the trees bare. I felt it in my bones, the same way an old man feels the rain before it falls. Something was coming, something terrible. And here's the part that still keeps me up at night. I wanted to believe in them. I wanted to believe that blood mattered more than money, that loyalty mattered more than ambition. I told myself they were just growing, finding their place. I told myself they loved me enough not to betray me. I was wrong. The empire I built wasn't just a company. It was a monument to sacrifice, a symbol of who I was and what I stood for. I had bled for it, sweated for it, given my youth and my health to make it stand tall. And the people I built it for, the very children whose names were etched into its future, were sharpening their knives behind my back. This story is not about numbers on a ledger or contracts signed in boardrooms. It's about the moment a father realizes his children see him not as a protector or a teacher, but as an obstacle to be removed. It's about betrayal so deep it cuts through blood and bone. And before the story is over, you'll see exactly what I mean. Because when the storm finally hit, when the truth finally tore through the walls of Harris and Sons, I wasn't just a father. I became something else, something my children never expected. They thought I was weak. They thought age had made me blind, that my love had made me soft. But they forgot the most important lesson I ever taught them. Never corner a man who has nothing left to lose. So yes, my name is Daniel Harris. I'm 67 years old. And this is the story of how my own children tried to take everything from me. My company, my legacy, my name. And how I made sure they regretted it. Betrayal doesn't begin with a knife in the back. No, it starts as a whisper, a glance, a silence that lasts too long. That's how it began for me. At Harris and Sons, I used to know everything that happened within those walls. Not because I was nosy, but because people trusted me. For decades, every foreman, every project manager, every accountant came to me with their problems. I knew which beams were cracking, which invoices were late, which contractors needed more time. My office was the heartbeat of the company. But slowly, almost without my noticing, that heartbeat changed. It began with Michael. He started holding meetings without telling me. At first, he called them strategy sessions for the younger executives, an effort to bring fresh ideas into the company. I didn't object. I thought maybe it was good for him to practice leadership. But then board members began quoting Michael's plans as if they were already law, as if my word no longer carried weight. "Dad, you've done incredible things," Michael would say with that politician smile of his. "But times are changing. We need new methods, new energy. Don't take it personally. It's just business." Just business. Funny how easily those words roll off the tongue, as if business and blood are separate things. Sarah, meanwhile, became more guarded. She'd always been my numbers girl, the one I could count on to catch mistakes and keep everything balanced. But suddenly, she wasn't showing me the books. Reports that used to land on my desk every Monday morning disappeared. Efficiency, she called it. Streamlining the process. But when I asked simple questions, where our cash flow stood, why certain accounts were hidden, her answers grew vague. And then there was David, my youngest, my dreamer. He'd always been different, less hungry for money, more interested in ideas and people. But even he began to change. He stopped visiting me in my office, stopped calling me Pop, like he used to. When I caught his eye in meetings, he'd look away. Guilt was written all over him, though he didn't have the courage to speak it. It was like watching cracks spread across a foundation. Small at first, harmless looking. But I've built enough skyscrapers to know that once cracks appear, they only deepen. One afternoon, I walked into the conference room without warning. Michael was standing at the head of the table, Sarah beside him, David sitting quietly at the far end. Around the table sat 3 board members and 2 investors I'd known for years. They were listening intently as Michael spoke, projecting confidence, laying out charts and plans that I'd never seen before. When I entered, the room went silent. Michael froze mid-sentence. Sarah closed her laptop in a hurry. David stared at the table. "What's this?" I asked. Michael didn't flinch. "Just a planning session, Dad. Nothing major." "Funny," I said. "It looks like a takeover plan." Laughter rippled nervously around the table, but no one denied it. That's when I knew. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. My children were carving me out of my own empire. Over the next weeks, the evidence piled higher. Longtime clients began canceling meetings with me, saying they'd already spoken with Michael. Financial statements showed irregular transfers, small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but large enough to raise red flags for anyone paying attention. Construction bids that used to cross my desk bypassed me entirely. I tried confronting Sarah one evening. I found her in her office, the glow of her computer screen lighting her face. "You're hiding things from me," I said. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. She didn't look at me. "Dad, please. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Harder than what?" "Than letting go." She finally turned, her eyes cold and sharp. "You've had your time. You built something incredible, but it's ours now. Michael and I can take it further than you ever dreamed. Don't you see? This isn't betrayal, it's the future." The words sliced deeper than any blade could. Later that night, I sat in my study, staring at the family portrait that hung above the fireplace. It was taken 20 years ago, when the kids were still young, before greed had twisted their hearts. In that picture, we looked happy, whole, a family bound by love. Now I wasn't sure what we were. The worst part wasn't the secrecy or the ambition. It was the realization that somewhere along the line, I had failed them. I had thought building an empire would unite us. Instead, it made them hungry, restless, entitled. I had given them every advantage, paid for their schools, put them in positions of power, trusted them with my life's work. And in return, they had begun chiseling away at the throne I still sat on. But don't mistake me for weak. A man doesn't survive 6 decades in business without learning how to spot betrayal. And once he sees it, once he names it for what it is, there's no going back. The seeds had been planted. I could see them sprouting in every corner of the company, growing in the shadows where loyalty used to live. My children thought they were clever, thought they could outmaneuver me. But what they had forgotten is this. I built Harris and Sons from the dirt with my own 2 hands. And if they thought I would just sit quietly and watch it be stolen, they didn't know me at all. No, this was only the beginning. Because when betrayal takes root, it eventually bears fruit. And when it did, I was ready to harvest it my way. There comes a point when betrayal stops hiding in shadows and steps into the light. For me, that day arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the sky hangs low, heavy with clouds that promise rain. I remember it vividly, because by the time the sun set, I knew the war for Harris and Sons had officially begun. I walked into the office just before 8, as I always did. I still believed in being the first one in and the last one out. That's how you show a company you're its backbone. But when I swiped my keycard at the front door, the lock didn't click open. I tried again. Nothing. Strange, I muttered, pressing the buzzer for security. When Tony, the guard who'd worked for me 15 years, finally came, he looked uneasy. "Morning, Mr. Harris," he said softly. "Your access card's been deactivated." My blood ran cold. Deactivated? By who? He hesitated. "I was told to check with Michael." Michael, my own son. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to explode right there in the lobby. Instead, I forced a smile. "Open the door, Tony." He did, and as I stepped inside, I realized the office didn't feel like mine anymore. People looked at me differently, some with pity, some with fear, some with thinly veiled disdain. It was like walking into a kingdom that had already crowned a new king, only no one had told the old one. I stormed into the conference room, where Michael and Sarah sat flanking the head of the table. Not my chair, theirs now. David was there too, hunched in the corner, silent and pale. "Would someone like to explain," I said, my voice low and controlled, "why I couldn't get into my own building this morning?" Michael leaned back in the chair, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've been discussing this for months. It's time for you to step down." Step down. My fists tightened at my sides. I built this company from nothing. And you, I jabbed a finger toward him, think you can just push me out? "It's not just me," Michael said smoothly. "The board agrees. The investors agree. Even Sarah agrees. Dad, face it, You're out of touch. You still run this place like it's the 1980s. Times have changed, and you haven't. Sarah spoke up then, her voice sharp, precise. This isn't personal. It's business. The contracts are ready. The paperwork has been filed. Effective immediately, Harris & Sons is under new leadership. New leadership. Those two words rang in my ears like a gunshot. I turned to David, my youngest, my dreamer. And you? I asked, my voice cracking. Do you stand with him too? He wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't want this, Pop. But maybe it's for the best. For the best. Something inside me snapped. I slammed both hands on the table, leaning forward until I was inches from Michael's smug face. For the best. You think stabbing your own father in the back is for the best? You think rewriting history and stealing my life's work is progress? Michael didn't flinch. If anything, his smile widened. You're tired, Dad. Everyone can see it. You've had your time. But empires don't last forever, not unless they evolve. And right now, you're the anchor dragging us down. The board voted this morning. You're officially relieved of your duties. The room spun around me. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relieved of my duties. My own children had pulled off a coup, and they hadn't even bothered to warn me. I looked around the room at the board members, men and women who had once sworn loyalty to me. None of them met my gaze. They all stared at the table, ashamed but silent. Cowards, every last one of them. I straightened, smoothing my jacket. My voice was steady, but ice cold. You think you've won? You think this company is yours because you tricked a few signatures out of frightened men? You're wrong. Harris & Sons isn't just contracts and cash flow. It's blood. It's my name on every building, every bridge, every piece of steel that holds the city up. You can steal the papers, but you'll never steal the foundation. Michael chuckled softly. Foundations crack, Dad. That's what you never understood. The meeting ended not with shouting, but with silence. They thought they had cornered me, stripped me of my power. They thought I would walk away quietly, defeated, humiliated. But as I left the building that day, I made a silent promise. If they wanted war, I'd give them war. Because Harris & Sons wasn't just a company. It was me. And no one, not even my own blood, was going to take it from me without a fight. That evening, I sat alone in my study, staring at the family portrait again. My children smiled back at me from 20 years ago, innocent and full of hope. How far they had fallen. How far we all had. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the kind I usually saved for victories. It burned my throat as I swallowed, but it cleared my mind. They thought I was old. They thought I was finished. They thought my love for them made me weak. But they had forgotten one thing. I didn't build Harris & Sons by being gentle. I built it by outsmarting men twice as ruthless as them. I built it by fighting for every inch, clawing my way up when the world tried to drag me down. And now, I was ready to do it again. This wasn't the end of Daniel Harris. No, this was only the beginning of my revenge. The silence after the coup was a kind of opportunity. When the house is quiet, you can hear your own thoughts, the good ones and the dangerous ones. I spent the first week after Michael's takeover moving like a man in exile inside his own life. I didn't call reporters, I didn't shout at board members, and I certainly didn't beg. Instead, I listened. I watched. I let them believe they had won. I let them taste the false victory while I rebuilt the war in private. The first thing I did was reach for the one man who had always stood by me in the worst storms. Hector Alvarez, my attorney of 30 years. Hector wasn't flashy. He smelled of old books and tobacco, and his suits looked like they had stories to tell. More importantly, he knew how to find an ugly truth and hold it up so the world couldn't look away. I drove to his office in the rain one afternoon and told him, simply, what had happened. I didn't unleash my fury. I saved that for the courtroom. Hector listened, eyes narrowing. You want them exposed? He asked. No, I said. I want them finished. He nodded. Then he smiled in a way that made me feel less like a broken man and more like a general with a plan. Good. Because there's always paperwork left behind by men who believe themselves cleverer than they are. We started at the obvious places. Signatures, transaction dates, and board meeting minutes. But the deeper work, the one Michael and Sarah thought no one would touch, was in the small, quiet places where arrogance leaves fingerprints. Ghost invoices, slightly inflated contractor fees that routed money to shell companies, emails with phrasing that didn't match Sarah's crisp tone, but matched an outside consultant Michael had brought in last year. Hector had a team crawl through every file, every server backup, every archived PDF. They were like forensic miners, pulling secrets from the dirt. Meanwhile, I called on another ally, a man I'd known since we poured concrete together in the company's earliest days, Tommy Rhodes. Tommy was the kind of friend who could get a foreman to spill a name over a beer, the kind who still loved the company as if it were a kid he'd watched grow up. I needed boots-on-the-ground intelligence. Tommy remembered contractors who had been cut off, suppliers who had been paid late, men who had been nudged to sign papers without full explanation. With him, I started to build a picture of where Michael had moved money and who in the network had helped him. As the evidence accumulated, a new problem appeared: timing. If we rushed Hector to court with a pile of documents, Michael's lawyers, slick, experienced, and hungry, would throw up procedural walls. They would stall. They would argue jurisdiction. They would leak counter-narratives. I had to turn this into a moment so clean, so damning, that no one could spin it into ambiguity. I needed leverage that did not depend solely on legal technicalities. That leverage came from an unexpected place: loyalty. There were people in my company who had been loyal because of respect, not fear. Men and women who had worked with me for decades and who still believed in the principles I had taught them. I spoke to them quietly, not as their boss, but as the man who had shared their mornings and the man who had stood by them through layoffs and storms. I asked a favor: help us document the truth. They did. They handed over emails, old memos, and even video clips of meetings where Michael had dismissed my presence as only ceremonial. Those voices, when played back, were corrosive. Ethan, no, not the son from the other story, but a contractor named Ethan who'd been with us 20 years, gave U.S. bank contacts. Our forensic accountants followed the trail to a set of shell corporations that funneled money to accounts traced to a consulting firm Michael had set up in his wife's maiden name. It was sloppy work masquerading as sophistication. That arrogance would be our undoing. As our dossier grew fat and unavoidable, I thought about the spectacle I wanted. I didn't want a private settlement where Michael walked away with a warning. I wanted a public unmasking that would strip his veneer of respectability. People needed to see the truth in daylight. Investors needed to see it with their own hands. So Hector and I crafted a move that would use everything at our disposal: legal pressure, board leverage, and public exposure. First, we secured a temporary injunction that prevented Michael from making any further transfers. Hector had found a clause buried in the company charter, an old protection I'd insisted on when the business was still small. No one had thought to use it. That injunction froze his power cold. Overnight, his ability to move assets tapped out. Board members, who had looked the other way, now scrambled to cover their tracks. Next, we fed select, tightly controlled evidence to a journalist I trusted from a city paper. Careful, factual disclosures that promised a bombshell. The goal wasn't to start a firestorm without fuel. It was to make sure the fire had air. The journalist did not disappoint. Within 48 hours, headlines began to ask questions about irregular transfers and contested signatures. Investors called the board, demanding explanations. The pressure turned physical. Phone calls, emergency meetings, lawyers in the hallways. Everything Michael thought he owned began to creak. While the public pressure built, Hector quietly filed a suit naming specific transfers and naming Michael and 2 complicit board members as defendants. The suit was surgical, targeted at the weakest joints in Michael's armor. We weren't trying to burn down the company. We were trying to excise the rot. But the most satisfying moment, the one that felt like payback for every sleepless night, came when one of Michael's closest allies, a CFO who had been promised promotion, walked into Hector's office and begged for a deal. He produced an email chain showing Michael had instructed him to handle the transfers discreetly and to keep Pop out of the loop. His hand shook as he spoke. Loyalty, when it's self-preservation, changes sides fast. By the time the board convened an emergency session, Michael was already on the defensive. For the first time since that gray Tuesday, I walked into Harris and Sons feeling a different kind of power. The power of truth aligned with allies. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I presented the evidence calmly, letting the documents talk. The room shifted. Where there had been arrogance, there was now a brittle fear. When the vote came to remove Michael from his interim post, pending investigation, it wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. The cameras outside caught the story, and the world watched as the crown that Michael had so greedily placed on his head began to tilt. I had not acted rashly. I had not attacked blindly. I had been patient, precise, and merciless in the way only someone who has been betrayed can be. I'd used every tool at my disposal, law, loyalty, and timing, to turn their victory into scaffolding for their fall. That night, in my study, the portrait above the fireplace looked different. My children's faces in the photo remained unchanged by time, but the story around them had altered. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, but this time it tasted like something else. Not revenge exactly, but a hard, clean justice. I had not taken everything back yet. There was more work ahead, but the counterattack had begun, and the people who thought they had rewritten my fate were now reading from a script I had authored. When betrayal reveals itself, you can burn or you can build. I chose to build, and what I was building now was the last thing my children expected. A comeback structured not on desperation, but on inevitability. The day I had been building toward for months arrived with a bitter, electric calm. I woke before dawn, not because I couldn't sleep, but because sleep felt like surrender. The annual shareholders meeting always drew a crowd. Investors in tailored coats, analysts with notepads, journalists with pens itching for a quote. This year, the room smelled different, equal parts anticipation and dread. Michael thought he would sit on the other side of the table and watch me crumble. He didn't know I'd redesigned the whole game. I walked into the conference hall with Hector at my side and a thin leather folder under my arm. The folder was heavier than its size suggested. Inside were months of work, the quiet labor of people who refused to let arrogance be the final verdict. There were bank statements and email threads, video clips of meetings, memos, transfer receipts, and sworn affidavits. There were the names of shell corporations, the timestamps that didn't match travel logs, the little human errors that men like Michael make when they are too sure of their cleverness. Most of all, there were confessions, quiet admissions recorded from men who had been bought by promises and frightened into compliance. The room shifted when I entered. Some faces drained, knowingly or unknowingly, toward the doorway like flowers toward sun. Cameras adjusted. Michael's smile was brittle. Sarah's jaw was tight. David avoided eye contact like a guilty child. The board table looked as it always had, polished wood, a circle of power. But by the time I sat, the balance had already changed. I didn't begin with accusations. I began with the building, our company, because no one should forget what was at stake. I reminded them of cornerstones and contracts, of decades of work and a name that had been trusted by cities and clients. I spoke of the men and women who had poured concrete and sweat, and of the families who relied on paychecks because of decisions we made. I wanted the room to feel what I felt, that this was not simply a fight over papers, but a fight over a legacy that bound real people. Then I opened the folder. The presentation began simply. Dates, transfers, and voices. Projected on the screen were emails with inconsistent phrasing, timestamps that contradicted travelogues, and invoices paid to companies that existed on paper only. I let the documents speak. I let the evidence do the humiliation for me, because there's a cruelty in watching a liar's carefully constructed castle topple under facts. One by one, Hector read excerpts, clean, precise language that left no room for spin. A video clip played where Michael, confident and unguarded, instructed an associate to keep Dad reassured while moving funds. A voicemail from a contractor revealed pressure to sign without full disclosure. An internal memo showed Sarah approving a transfer labeled as operational, while the money slid into a consulting firm registered under a false name. The room's hum died to a low, horrified whisper. Michael stood up the way someone stands when they plan to yell. This is manipulation, he shouted, voice thin. You fabricated this. No, I said, cutting through him. You fabricated it. You forged signatures. You hid transfers. You leveraged my name to make yourself king. My words were quiet, but they landed like hammers. Cameras leaned in. I watched his face change, from anger to panic, to something that resembled the small boy who once sat in my lap and promised he'd never disappoint me. That boy was gone. Only the man who had calculated betrayals remained. The board asked for clarification. Investors demanded immediate audits. The journalists began to murmur the words I'd fed them earlier in private briefings. Irregular transfers. Conflicted interests. Forged documentation. It unfolded like a theater piece I'd rehearsed for months, and every actor played their part except for the guilty. Then came the knockout. A sworn statement from the CFO, who had been promised promotion, the same man who had once looked me in the eye and said, "I owe you this." He testified to having followed explicit instructions from Michael and Sarah to reroute payments. He produced emails with subject lines that read ordinary things: vendor update, payables, but attached were transfer authorizations bearing the marks of fraud. The evidence was surgical. Michael sputtered defenses about misunderstandings and business complexities, but the board did not have the appetite to protect him. People who had once nodded at his speeches now shuffled papers nervously. Sarah's eyes filled with a sheen that might have been tears or the glitter of panic. David leaned forward and, with the wobble of a man about to break, admitted he had signed papers he didn't understand because he trusted his siblings. His voice broke. Mine did too, but for different reasons. When the vote came to suspend Michael and Sarah pending investigation and to form an independent audit committee, the tally was decisive. The crown they'd plucked from my head had been tossed back into the arena, where truth would slice it apart. As the room moved to an adjournment, reporters surged forward, microphones extended like spears. I answered only one question. Why did you do this now? Because truth is a slow weapon, I said, and it's the only one I trust. After the meeting, I called the family in, an arranged, formal thing that heard in its clinical finality. They sat opposite me in the small conference room that had once hosted strategy sessions and birthday cakes. The air was taut. Michael tried to put on a posture of authority and failed. Sarah stared at the table. David looked small and ashamed. "I'm not here to humiliate you more than you already have been," I said. "This is not about spectacle. It's about accountability." I slid a document across the table, a new will and a corporate trust amendment I had prepared months earlier and only executed when Hector told me the timing was right. In it, I explained plainly how the company would be governed going forward, who would sit on the trust board, and what losses would be recouped from any assets concealed or misappropriated. I had reorganized ownership to protect the company and the employees who depended on it. I had disinherited those whose hands were stained with betrayal. "You built this on our backs," Sarah whispered, as if pleading. "I built this with my hands, my mind, and my life," I answered. "And I built it so people would not suffer when greed knocked at our door. They would be left with legal repercussions, with reputational ruin that would follow them for years. But I didn't revel in watching them fall. The revenge I wanted was not the sight of their ruin so much as the restoration of what mattered: the company's stability, the workers' livelihoods, the truth that my name would not be dragged into the mud." Still, as they left, I could not deny the hard satisfaction that settled in my chest. The men who had tried to erase me now stared at their hands as if they belonged to strangers. Months later, courts would sort penalties and settlements. Regulators would oversee restitution. Some allies would return, chastened and sincere. I sat back in my office once more and looked at the skyline, the bridges and buildings tagged with our firm's projects. The portrait above my fireplace, the one with younger, smiling faces, felt like a relic that had finally been understood for what it was. A reminder of what had been risked and what had been defended. I never wanted this war. I never wanted my family torn apart. But someone attempted to make my life's work a ladder for their selfish ascent. So I responded not with blind rage, but with preparation, patience, and the kind of resolve that only time and loss can teach a man. On the day the final order issued, as the company's new trust structure took effect, and the press released the court summary, my voice, hoarse with weeks of tense work, carried across a packed room once more. I looked at the empty chair that had once been Michael's and spoke the line that felt like the end of a long and dangerous sentence. I built this empire, and I will decide how it ends, not you. The words hung there like a verdict. They were not about money alone. They were a final reclaiming of dignity, of legacy, and of power. And in that reclaiming, I found a peace that was not the absence of scars, but the knowledge that what I'd built would survive the greed of my own blood.